I think it's really like it's almost the same question as how do you gain more conscious awareness or conscious control over your decisions or your life. I think it's another way to rephrase exactly the same question around how do I just not you know, how do I not get surprised or overwhelmed? It's exactly the same question, but just looking at it from the other side, right? Is that um yeah, there's a consciousness spectrum there too, perhaps, right? And then when the body is charged, we're almost never present and aware when that happens. And it happens so many times a day that we're not even aware of that, right? It's a lot of work to try to be aware of your state as soon as you're triggered. And yeah, but I think if we're not trying to reduce it to binary thoughts, I think that it really is an empowering state because then we could say, okay, well, it still takes me 2 days, but it's better than 3 days. Like,
Mhm.
and that's meaningful, right? And then you can become more and more aware. I mean, ideally, you get to a point where you're presently aware and you're aware of your own internal resistance to a trigger as it happens, and then you're able to release it. And the releasing component stems from flexibility training and in a deep way. But um, yeah,
Well, I think
anyway,
there's something to be said for if you want better answers, ask better questions. And I don't think this is just a mindset thing. I think it's
mm,
actually sourcing your own smarts to figure out a process, whether you can do that process for yourself or you need to do it with another person. However, one of the questions, instead of the how can I never be surprised or make
mm.
sure that I'm never knocked off balance, is kind of, I consider that a pretty low grade question, right? You're not going to get great answers, but an
But I
elevated
think
one,
many would ask it the same way, and
I
I think
think
are
so too.
curious. Yeah,
Um, the question you were alluding to, that I think is a little bit elevated is what would need to be true to be okay with being surprised? What would need to be
yeah,
different or change so that I'm okay being knocked off balance
yeah,
times? And I think that informs a more intelligent answer around development,
yeah.
whether somebody can, like I said, do it themselves. Likely they would benefit greatly from not trying to do it themselves because
Mm.
they're looking at the answer for the answer in the same thinking, the same machinery that's created the imbalance, the problem. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the easiest way to do that is just to be exposed to an environment that doesn't respect your delusions. But that's
Yep.
also the most confronting and awful, right? But like it takes, this is one of the problems with martial arts, and also correlates to the same solution that we just talked about, which is that people training for a time that don't pressure test their techniques have very rarely have transference of those techniques into the dynamic environment of somebody wanting to do you harm, which is also very different than a competitive setting or even somebody still in your studio that's trying to put the pressure on or just trying to defeat you. Still a very different level of um, violence or conflict than somebody that wants to take your life or has assaulted you or is, there's still those levels. And at each one, you might recognize a breakdown in what works and what what doesn't work. I listened to a great comedian, a comic episode. I need to find it for you, but a couple of days ago, and I don't remember the guy's name, but he talked about he just kind of signed up for a karate tournament. He thought it was kind of like the UFC, like no holds barred, everybody goes. It's a 21 man kind of thing. He signed up for it, and he doesn't practice martial arts. And he was like, anybody can sign up. This is awesome. And he's tattooed from head to toe, right? So he looks like maybe a specialized gangbanger of sorts or something like that. But very funny guy. But he went against he did. He also didn't know the rules, right? And it turned out to be a point fighting tournament. And in point fighting, there are a lot of rules and a lot of assumptions about how things go. And it was a great example because he didn't know any of the rules and he didn't have any of the assumptions. And he thought the only goal was to win. So he's paired up against a guy who's probably been doing it for 30 years, but with all of the assumptions. The guy's overweight by probably 50 to 100 pounds, never gets properly pressure tested. Anytime somebody scores a point, they break them, the whole thing. So over the series of, 5 or 10 minutes, this comedian wound up, hit, and the guy also wore glasses to make it worse. So, he didn't know, he's like, well, this guy must be really confident if he's wearing glasses against me. So I better go really hard. And so, no, it's just, they never hit each other in the face. So he wound up in the course of 5 minutes, like kicking the guy in the gut and hitting him in the face. And when he was knocked down, he hit him again, like he just essentially unloading on the guy. And of course, he's got his friends who all look the same, head to toe and tattoos in the bleachers, going crazy for him. And everybody else was like, what the fuck is going on?
Sounds amazing.
So he basically beat the hell out of a
Great
black belt, but it's a good example because the black belt in that case represents somebody that he's in his world and he's got great control over it. He doesn't expect to be taken out of his element and put off guard. And it just took one guy that didn't have the same belief system to show him that reality and basically undermine 30 years of his life practice because he doesn't know martial arts, right? And that's the neither one of them do, but that's the problem.
What a clear example of, what a clear example.
Yeah. And so like within your jujitsu training and I think within martial arts in general, there's this element around, so a good assumption is that you can have a scope of competence, right? But you have to define that and you have to know what it is. And the problem is a lot of people practice a lot of techniques and they think that those transfer. And some of them might, but you need to have a scope that is so well honed and that's yours. And you need to understand how to get to it. Because what happens is you're going to be surprised in a fight and on the streets or whatever. And we've even talked about this. You said a lot of fights wind up on the ground. Probably a lot of them do. And there's certain assumptions around how these might play out. But it's really important, no matter what your skill set is, whether you're a striker or a grappler or whatever, that you find a way to get to your scope of competence very quickly. And if you can do that, then a lot of the things that you don't know and can get surprised by, the risk can be mitigated from those things because there are infinitely many ways to get surprised, especially in a fight. And I think it's the same thing in life. And so I think that having something, and what I said in terms of somatic competence, what's your practice that gets you to center? And that's just a centering practice, right? I realize that I've been triggered. Ideally, I wouldn't have that realization after the fact, and I just don't get triggered. Okay, that's not life. But let's say that somebody I'm a striker, somebody does a double leg takedown on me and I'm on my back on the streets. Big problem. Now the question is not, okay, how do I make sure that never happens? The question is, how quickly do I get back to my scope of genius? Because I know that if I'm on my feet, I can go to work. On my back,
whether you actually can or not. Because I think there's a level of
and that's the training
you're
factor.
off center, right? And you need to get back to center, and you might breathe and recenter, but then you still can't let it go. Like it really has you,
right?
Like rumination.
And this is that dual element of, on the one hand, is the capacity there to do damage in the right place, or in the case of mind body training, do I have enough? Is my system primed enough to give me the space to choose, to be consciously aware now, and either to release baggage, make an alternative choice, or do something like that. And then the second one is, am I aware enough right now to make that decision? And that would be the point of somatic competence, to have the wherewithal to say, oh, I have a choice right now. And now I need to, call that in. And that's, how do I get back to center or scope of genius or whatever it is?
Yeah. There's a verbal way sometimes this is outside of obviously literal fighting technique. But there's a literal way sometimes when there's a social disagreement that I found, where if it just takes one person who goes, I'm sorry, I'm not listening.
Yeah.
right? And like actually like
Mhm.
that's a capacity thing too, because sometimes I don't know if you've ever been in an argument and you kind of know that you're in the wrong and you're maybe being a jerk, but you won't stop.
Yeah,
And for whatever reason, right? But until later, and then you're like, oh yeah, that was on me.
for
I
sure.
really ramped up that discussion. And so I found that that's even a way of centering, but actually centering not solo sport, but in like communication,
Yeah,
where it does take a breath, like, and actually in a physical coming back to
yeah,
your, feet, your shoulders, that sort of thing. But also like a verbal, like, okay, let me start again. I came in real
totally.
hot there.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, have you seen, and exactly, like there should be, if there is an external or a physical reorientation and not just um a psychological one, it's very powerful. And I don't know if you've seen the show The Bear, about it's a series about a chef.
mm-mm.
It's phenomenal. It's phenomenal. It's great. But in the second season, he and then his like the gal that's kind of his right hand in the business, the whole series is just, it's chaos uh, for entrepreneurs, and it's a great example of what you're getting into probably as an entrepreneur. And they're trying to build the business, and at one point he tells his right hand, he's like, look, if we get into the weeds, he's like, we used to do this at this other place that I was at, and we would just, you know, rub our chest like this, and when one person does it, then the other person mirrors it, and then they both reset. And it's so subtle, and I'm sure people do this kind of thing, and but that was a great way of, I think, inviting the other person into resetting without needing a verbal cue. And it also is felt, right? It draws the attention to the body, the heart, and it's like, okay, we have the same values, we want to go to the same place, we're just stuck, like let's move forward. It
That's really
was very
cool.
cool.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that is